Today we're going to be looking at Stave 1. As always, I like to start with a quote. So the quote we're going to look at today talks about the beginning of the book. It says that the novella opens with the clear statement that Marley was dead to begin with. His business partner, Ebenezer Scrooge, a shrewd, nasty man, had even signed the register of burial. Scrooge had been Jacob Marley's only friend, his sole executor, his sole administrator, and sole mourner. So, why is the opening of a book important? Well, you probably know this from your GCSE English language when you look at creative writing. The beginning of the book serves as the hook. And here I think the first sentence does a really good job. Marley was dead to begin with. What does that suggest? It suggests that death is not the end. What does that link to? The fact that it's a ghost story. We then get a very vivid portrayal of one of the most famous characters in English literature, Ebenezer Scrooge. So he's described as shrewd, which means quite calculating, but of course nasty, which is a key aspect of his personality. So Jacob Marley is also depicted as a very lonely man. Scrooge is his only friend, sole executor, so the guy taking care of all of his affairs after he dies. Administrator means something similar. And mourner, there's only one person who's sad about his death. So there is some foreshadowing here. If you know the rest of the book, you'll recognise that something similar happens in the portrayal of Scrooge potentially in the future. In a way, that's even worse because at least Jacob Marley has one mourner. The Scrooge that's shown in the future is shown to have no mourners. In fact, it's quite the opposite. There are several people who are very happy that he's died because they profit off his death. Whether it's Caroline and her husband, who no longer have to pay back a debt to Scrooge, because the debt's going to be transferred to someone else who can't possibly be as terrible as Scrooge, or whether it's the thieves that pilfer the blankets even that he's buried with. People are actually happy that he's died. So it makes it very clear, I think, when you look at the book as a whole, that Marley's there to serve as a warning to Scrooge. So, going through a plot summary of Stave 1, here are some of the key events. Scrooge signs the register of burial for his deceased friend and business partner, Marley. We learn that Scrooge, having never removed Marley's name from the warehouse door, is sometimes called Marley. One Christmas Eve, exactly 7 years after Marley's death, Scrooge receives a visit from his nephew while at work. When his nephew wishes him a Merry Christmas and invites him to Christmas dinner, Scrooge gets angry, asks him why he got married, and dismisses him. As his nephew leaves, two men enter and ask Scrooge what he'll contribute to charity for the poor. Scrooge says he wishes to be left alone, arguing that the poor should either be in prison or in the workhouses. When the men explain that many would rather die than go to these institutions, Scrooge said they had better do it. The men leave, and Scrooge gets back to work with an improved opinion of himself and in a more facetious temper. Meanwhile, outside, the fog and darkness thicken and the cold intensifies. A young caroller sings outside Scrooge's door, but flees in terror when Scrooge grabs a ruler. As it gets to closing time, Scrooge begrudgingly confirms that his clerk will have the whole of Christmas Day off. Scrooge leaves work and has his usual melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern. He returns home, and we learn that he lives alone in a gloomy suite of rooms where Marley used to live. Before going through the door, Scrooge briefly sees Marley's ghostly face in the door knocker. Unnerved, he then thinks he can see a locomotive hearse in front of him on the staircase. Satisfied that the other rooms are all as they should be, he double locks himself in, dresses for bed, and eats his gruel. A disused bell begins to ring, as do all the other bells in the house, followed by a clanking noise. He then hears heavy chains being dragged around. A sound he remembers is associated with ghosts in haunted houses. Okay, so let's go back and analyse this. So we know that Scrooge is the only one mourning the loss of his friend and business partner, Marley. And interestingly, when customers come into the counting house where Marley used to work, and Scrooge still works, they sometimes call him Marley because he's never bothered to have Marley's name removed from the door. The reason I've put this in as a significant point is because I think it can easily be overlooked. To me, it suggests that Scrooge doesn't really care about his personal identity. A lot of people focus on how terrible Scrooge is, and rightly so. He does say some awful stuff and do some awful stuff too, even as early as Stave 1. However, I do think there's a sadness in not caring about your individual identity. It almost suggests that he's kind of given up on life, that he can't be bothered to correct people when they're getting his name wrong. One criticism of capitalism is that it deprives people of their individuality, partly because people are just expected to work as much as possible and gain as much money as possible. So in a way, I think Scrooge not caring that he's sometimes called Marley seems to be a signal that he's resigned himself to capitalism. A big part of this is because gain, especially financial gain, became his master passion, as his former fiancée Belle called it. So it's like not caring about his individuality is a tacit acceptance of capitalism. So when Scrooge's nephew, who we later find out is called Fred, shows up, it becomes really clear, even from this initial encounter, that the two characters are foils to one another. So a foil is simply a character that goes alongside another to show how different those two characters are. So for example, Scrooge's nephew is cheerful, young, friendly. Scrooge, on the other hand, miserable, old, unfriendly. So they have a short exchange, and Fred very kindly invites his uncle to Christmas dinner, and Scrooge tells him to get lost. Obviously, not in those exact words, but you get the idea. And then we have two charity collectors show up, and they assume that Scrooge will contribute at least something for the poor, given that Christmas is a time when they particularly suffer. And Scrooge similarly tells them to get lost, but I think it's in a much more disconcerting way than it was with his nephew. Because when Scrooge says that he thinks that the poor should be in prison, and again, as we saw in the last class, that means a debtor's prison rather than a prison for hardened criminals, let's say, or the workhouses, which are really terrible places, which we'll come on to soon, the men have to say, well, listen, a lot of people would rather die than go to these places, and Scrooge encourages them to die. He says if that's what they want, then it's going to be better for the population. We'll come on to that shortly when we look at some of the key quotes. So Scrooge is quite happy with this exchange, and obviously the men are left quite shaken up by it, understandably. So then we get some really gothic elements with the weather. It's also an example of pathetic fallacy, where the weather reflects the mood of a character. The fog and the darkness thicken, the cold gets worse. We've got this carol singer, absolutely included, because the book is, of course, called A Christmas Carol, and he starts to sing what seem to be the words of a Christmas carol called God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen. Scrooge, just as he's done with his nephew and with the charity collectors, sends the little boy on his way. The poor boy's terrified, as you would be, if somebody snapped a ruler at you. And then Bob Cratchit, Scrooge's clerk, comes along and confirms that he'll have the following day off. So Scrooge is really not happy about this, and it might seem really odd because nowadays it would be taken as a given that you have Christmas Day off in most jobs. But back then it would be something that you'd have to agree with your employer, and Scrooge is obviously not keen to do it, but he does reluctantly accept. You can tell that Scrooge is a bit of a loner, given the fact that he has this routine and none of it is marked by time with other people. So he has his usual melancholy dinner and his usual melancholy tavern, basically cheerless. And even where he lives is described as gloomy. Now, what's weird is Scrooge starts to see some ghostly sights, which is a sign of things to come, including Marley's face in the door knocker, a locomotive hearse, which is sort of like a funeral car, and then he experiences an auditory manifestation, as in something that he hears when the bells start ringing. So he does realise that this could all point to a haunting, but as we'll see, he's very reluctant to believe it. So the next part of the stave goes as follows. An incredulous Scrooge insists that all of these events are humbug, but his colour changes upon seeing Marley's ghost. Marley looks the same, apart from being transparent and tied up in a still chain of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses. Marley asks why Scrooge doesn't believe in him, to which Scrooge replies that the senses can't be trusted. Scrooge tries cracking jokes to distract himself and ease his terror. When Marley lets out a dreadful cry and shakes his chain, Scrooge drops to his knees and accepts that the ghost is real. Marley explains that he is doomed to wander the earth, that he forged his chain of his own free will during his life, and that he has sat beside Scrooge many times before, but is only now visible to him. He warns Scrooge not to end up like him, and tells him that he will be haunted by 3 spirits over 3 nights. Scrooge once again jokingly resists the idea, but Marley explains that this is the only way Scrooge can avoid Marley's fate. Marley goes to leave through the window, and Scrooge follows him. Scrooge looks out the window to see the air filled with restless, wandering, moaning phantoms, all covered in chains. The narrator tells us that Scrooge personally knew many of the phantoms during their lives, and that the phantoms all wanted to help people but had lost the power forever. After the phantoms fade away, Scrooge sees that the door is still double locked. He tries to say humbug, but is stopped at the first syllable. He finally goes to bed, where he immediately falls asleep. So if we go back and take a look at this, incredulous just means not believing. Scrooge is convinced that all of this is nonsense or humbug, which becomes his catchphrase, by the way. Bah, humbug. But eventually he does have to admit that Marley really is there right in front of him. Only after he starts cracking some jokes. So one of the funniest bits, I think, in the book is when Marley says to him, "Why don't you think I'm here?" And Scrooge says, "Well, you can't really trust your senses. You could be a bit of undigested beef." So that's pretty funny. However, when Marley starts to scream and shake the chain, Scrooge is like, "Yeah, okay, fine, you're here." So Marley explains what's going on. He's doomed to wander the earth. And this is a key point, by the way. He forged his chain of his own free will during his life. Nobody has forced Marley into this fate. It's all of his own doing. We'll come back onto the chain shortly. And this bit's quite creepy. Marley sat beside Scrooge many times before, so you can imagine if you encountered a ghost like, "I've actually been with you loads of different times before." That could either be comforting or scary, depending on how you feel about it. But in this case, I think it's something that creeps Scrooge out. So you might be wondering as a reader, why is it only now that Scrooge can see Marley, given that Marley's been there many times before? It suggests, I think, that Scrooge's transformation is a long time coming. It's long overdue, let's say. So Marley says, "Scrooge, don't end up like me. You're going to be haunted by 3 spirits over 3 nights. And again, Scrooge, like he did with the beef joke, resorts to humour. He says, "Can't I just get it all over and done with in one night?" And Marley says, "No, this is the only way that you can avoid my fate." So when he sees the other ghosts, he realises that Marley isn't the only one suffering in the afterlife. The difference is that there are many phantoms who don't actually have Marley's opportunity to help people, no matter how much they want it. So it's interesting. So because the door is still double locked after the phantoms fade away, Scrooge goes to say humbug again. He's trying to reason his way out of what he's just experienced. But it's interesting that he stopped at the first syllable. It's as if to say that there is some real truth and veracity to what he's just encountered, and the very end of the book actually confirms that. Taking a look at some key quotations then. I mentioned this one that Scrooge says, "If the poor had rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population." What he's saying is, in response to the charity collectors who say that many poor people would rather die than go to workhouses or debtors' prisons, Scrooge is essentially saying, fine, let them. Because if they die, then it will be better because we already have a population that's too large. So having some poor people die will improve that and ease the pressure that's caused by overpopulation. Sounds like a really evil idea, but it's not unique to Scrooge. This is actually something called the Malthusian principle, which I'll talk about more when we get onto the social and historical context of the book. But suffice to say, it's a Malthusian idea that Scrooge is putting forward here in this quote. We also see some lovely hyperbole here. Every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. It's a great way of showing how much Scrooge genuinely hates Christmas, but it does make us wonder why on earth he has this attitude, something that many people would see as a good thing, including his nephew and his foil, Fred, who conversely says, though Christmas has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good and will do me good. God bless it. Christmas is a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time. So it's very, very different to what Scrooge has just said. And again, that's deliberate. Now, onto Marley. The chain is a very important symbol. And another important part of this quote is the fact that Marley girded and wore it of his own free will. This is a Christian concept. The idea that whatever our fate is, certainly in the afterlife, when it comes to whether we go to heaven or hell or some kind of weird limbo that Marley seems to be in, it's all of our own doing. We can't blame other people for our wrongdoings. It's down to us. The reason that this is a Judeo-Christian concept is because the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis 3, the fall, supports this. Adam and Eve suffer because they chose to disobey God, not because God was arbitrarily punishing them. However, another Christian message is of redemption, in other words, the hope to change after having done something wrong, or in Scrooge's case, many things wrong. So there is a positive to be gained from it if Scrooge is open to taking the opportunity. Marley's gone out of his way to procure a chance for Scrooge to redeem himself. Whether he takes it, though, we'll see. So, in your own time, I'd recommend that you watch the opening scene as well as the scene where Marley tells Scrooge he'll be haunted. I love the visuals in this. And answer the questions down here. You've also got your quiz to complete in your own time, your glossary, further reading resources, and some homework. So once you've done all that, I'll give you some feedback, and then I'll see you in the next class.